Morning of June 6, 1944. The Normandy coast lay shrouded in mist, the tide still turning beneath a low grey sky. Offshore, beyond the reach of German coastal artillery, a vast assembly of ships drifted in formation, thousands of vessels stretching to the horizon. Among the waves, German spotters aboard forward observation posts peered through binoculars, bewildered by the scale of what they saw. Landing craft advanced in ordered waves, transports unloaded columns of tanks, and destroyers fired in relentless rhythm. But what unsettled the German command most was not the assault itself. It was the question every radio operator and intelligence officer kept repeating that morning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Where were the ports? Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had warned Berlin that the enemy could not sustain an invasion without capturing one. For 2 years, every German defensive calculation had rested on that immutable law of military logistics. Ports were lifelines. Without them, no army, no matter how numerous, could survive longer than a few days on the beaches of France. Yet as reports streamed in from the 15th Army, the 7th Army, and the Naval Command West, a disturbing realization began to spread through the Wehrmacht's high command. The Allies had landed in force, and they were not attacking any port at all. By mid-morning, teletypes clattered inside the chateau at La Roche-Guyon, Rommel's headquarters on the Seine. Intelligence summaries confirmed the scale of the assault over 4,000 landing craft, supported by nearly 7,000 naval vessels. General Alfred Jodl at OKW headquarters in Rastenburg demanded immediate clarification. "How do they intend to supply themselves?" he asked in disbelief. Rommel's operations officer replied bluntly, "They cannot. It is impossible." That word impossible had defined German military thinking for years. Every strategic assumption of the Atlantic Wall, every ton of concrete poured along the French coast, was built upon the simple principle that any invading army would require deep-water docking facilities to land heavy equipment, ammunition, and fuel. Destroy those ports or fortify them, and the enemy would collapse under the weight of his own success. It was a belief so deeply held that it became doctrine. Since 1941, when Adolf Hitler first issued Directive No. 40, the German war machine had embarked on one of the largest construction programs in human history, the creation of Fortress Europe. Thousands of TOT organization workers, engineers, and prisoners of war labored day and night to encase the continent's western edge in concrete. At Cherbourg, Le Havre, and Saint-Nazaire, reinforced gun batteries loomed above the surf. Steel embrasures framed the barrels of naval cannon repurposed from battleships. At each harbour entrance, underwater mines and scuttled wrecks blocked the channels. Machine gun nests overlooked the docks. Everything about the Atlantic Wall reflected the same conclusion that ports, not beaches, would decide the fate of Europe. In December 1943, Rommel himself had undertaken a grueling inspection of the French coastline, from the sand dunes of the Netherlands to the granite cliffs of Brittany. What he saw convinced him that the only way to stop an invasion was to crush it before it reached dry land. He ordered the placement of over 6 million mines along the beaches, the construction of wooden and steel obstacles to tear open landing craft, and the emplacement of anti-tank ditches and concrete walls behind the dunes. But when it came to the ports, his orders were unambiguous. They were to be defended to the last man. Each was to be a fortress, self-sufficient, provisioned for months of siege, armed with coastal batteries capable of engaging targets 10 miles offshore. It was in those fortresses that the German command placed its faith. At Cherbourg, the garrison commander, Lieutenant General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, kept a framed map of the harbour beside his desk, a network of docks, cranes, and breakwaters marked in red pencil. In every training exercise, he drilled his officers on one scenario: how to destroy the harbour before it fell into Allied hands. At Brest, in Brittany, the naval commander ordered demolition charges wired to every quay and lock gate. The standing order was clear: no functioning port would ever be left for the invader. The irony, of course, was that by the time those men prepared their defences, the Allies had already moved beyond the logic that governed them. The story of that shift of how the concept of a port itself was reinvented began 2 years earlier, in the aftermath of failure. August 19, 1942. Dieppe, on the French Channel coast, was burning. British and Canadian troops, who had landed that morning under Operation Jubilee, were being slaughtered on the shingle beaches. 27 Churchill tanks lay wrecked or burning. Of nearly 5,000 Canadians who had stormed ashore, fewer than half would return to England. The rest lay dead, wounded, or captured. German defenders in concrete bunkers watched the disaster unfold with detached precision. From their perspective, Dieppe had proven what Berlin already believed, that without the capture of a major port, no invasion could succeed. The Germans drew the wrong lesson, but so, initially, did the Allies. In London, the War Office reeled from the disaster. Reports from the Admiralty concluded that direct assaults on fortified ports were suicidal. Yet that same conclusion forced a question that few dared to articulate. If ports could not be captured, could they somehow be built? That idea, at once absurd and prophetic, took root in the mind of one man, Winston Churchill. Even before Dieppe, Churchill had written to his staff with an audacious directive: piers for use on beaches. They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. Let me have the best solution worked out. Do not argue the matter. It was typical Churchill brief, imperious and visionary, but the notion of building an artificial port in the open sea seemed fantastical. The physics alone were staggering. The English Channel was one of the roughest bodies of water in the world, its tides rising and falling nearly 20 feet twice daily. Storms could smash concrete like glass, and yet Churchill's memo would become the seed of a revolution in warfare logistics. In early 1943, a small group of British naval architects and engineers gathered under the direction of Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. They worked in secrecy from modest offices and shipyards across Britain at Southampton, Portsmouth, and along the Clyde, experimenting with designs that defied precedent. They envisioned harbours built from floating concrete caissons, linked by steel roadways, anchored to the seabed by adjustable pylons. The components would be prefabricated in Britain, towed across the Channel, and assembled under fire on the beaches of France. To those who heard of it, the project sounded deranged. One admiral dismissed it as nautical lunacy. The Royal Navy's Technical Bureau declared it impossible. And yet, out of that ridicule emerged what the Allies would come to call the Mulberry harbours. By late 1943, the first prototypes were already being tested in the cold, grey waters off Scotland and Wales. Locals who stumbled upon them thought they were coastal fortifications or oil storage tanks. They were, in fact, the future massive hollow concrete structures called Phoenix caissons, some longer than 200 feet and rising 6 stories tall. When sunk offshore, they would form artificial breakwaters, calming the sea for ships to unload. Floating roadways, nicknamed whales, would connect cargo vessels to the shore. At the seaward end, steel platforms called spuds could raise or lower with the tide, allowing trucks to roll directly onto land. The complexity was staggering. Over 2,000 separate units would need to be fabricated, each labelled, towed, and assembled like an immense industrial puzzle. The total weight exceeded 1 million tons, but the real miracle was that it was all done in secrecy. Even the workers constructing the pieces did not know what they were building. Across the Channel, German intelligence remained blind to it all. Their reconnaissance flights photographed strange shapes along British estuaries, rectangular hulls, barges, concrete monoliths, but analysts dismissed them as storage silos or anti-submarine defences. The Wehrmacht's intelligence section, Fremde Heere West, focused instead on predicting invasion sites. Their analysts debated endlessly whether the Allies would strike at Calais, the Seine estuary, or perhaps the Bay of Biscay. No one imagined that the invaders would bring their own ports with them. By spring of 1944, the Allied High Command had accepted the Mulberry concept as essential. Eisenhower's planners calculated that within days of the invasion, they would need to land not only men and tanks, but thousands of tons of supplies, daily fuel, ammunition, rations, spare parts, and medical equipment. Without functioning ports, the invasion would starve. The Mulberries were the answer. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. And so, when dawn broke on June 6, 1944, and the first assault waves struck the beaches of Normandy, the fate of the entire operation depended on a secret that not even most Allied soldiers knew existed. As the morning unfolded, German radio intercepts reported frantic requests from their coastal garrisons for reinforcements. Yet among those reports lay the first faint indications of something stranger. Off Arromanches, near the British landing sector, reconnaissance observers noted unusual barges anchored offshore. By midday, Naval Command at Cherbourg had received conflicting descriptions: giant boxes, floating piers, strange steel roadways extending from ships toward the beach. At first, headquarters dismissed them as misidentified landing craft, but by late afternoon, aerial photographs began to confirm the impossible. Something immenser was taking shape along the coast, vast artificial structures where none had existed before. It was then that the disbelief began to fracture. By the time Field Marshal von Rundstedt received confirmation that evening, his staff realized the implications. The enemy had solved the very problem that underpinned all German strategy. They no longer needed ports. The mathematics of invasion, the calculation that had governed German defense since 1941 had collapsed in a single day. What the Germans had believed immutable, the Allies had rendered obsolete, and within 6 hours of that realization, the first of the Mulberry harbours would begin landing over 9,000 tons of supplies daily, enough to feed, fuel, and arm an army the size of Rome's legions, all without capturing a single port. June 7, 1944. The second dawn over Normandy broke beneath a blanket of drifting smoke. Inland, the air smelled of cordite and churned earth. The beaches, those strips of sand now etched into history as Sword, Juneau, Gold, Omaha, and Utah, were no longer beaches at all. They were ports in the making. Bulldozers, still reeking of salt spray, roared through the surf, clearing wreckage and levelling sand for truck convoys. Engineers waded waist-deep in freezing water, driving stakes for mooring lines. Offshore, an armada of tugs and flat-bottomed bargers formed a moving city, their wakes crossing in white arcs across the channel. Somewhere amid that floating chaos, the impossible was beginning to take shape. To the untrained eye, it appeared like madness ships anchored without order, cranes operating from pontoons, steel roadways vanishing into the mist. But to the men who designed it, this was orchestration. This was the culmination of 2 years of quiet, improbable engineering, a symphony of logistics conducted by planners who had never set foot on the beaches themselves. On the afternoon of June 7th, Admiral Bertram Ramsay, the naval commander of Operation Overlord, sent a terse message to Allied headquarters. Initial elements of artificial harbour successfully positioned. Assembly proceeding under fire. His tone was dry, almost clinical. The truth was anything but. The waters off Arromanches were a battlefield. Luftwaffe bombers still prowled the skies, their black crosses flashing silver in the clouds. German coastal batteries at Longues-sur-Mer continued to shell the area with 155mm guns, their salvos landing perilously close to the construction site. Every time the sirens wailed, work halted. Every time the all-clear sounded, it resumed. And yet, by nightfall, the first breakwaters were already in place. These breakwaters, massive concrete giants known as Phoenix caissons, were the heart of the Mulberry system. Each one was a monolith, hollow but immenser, built in British shipyards months earlier, their compartments sealed like the chambers of a submarine. Now, after being towed across the channel by tugboats at barely 3 knots, they were being sunk deliberately, row by row, to form an artificial wall against the open sea. From the cliffs, soldiers of the British 50th Infantry Division watched as the structures vanished beneath the waves, the tops still visible like grey islands. Behind them came the floating piers, the whales stretching toward the horizon, swaying gently with the tide. Each roadway section, 80 feet long and steel-girded, rested on pontoons that rose and fell with the water. When bolted together, they formed a continuous bridge from ship to shore. Trucks could drive directly from freighters onto land, loaded with ammunition, fuel drums, and field rations. For the first time in history, a harbour was not a place, it was an idea. On the German side, disbelief turned to confusion. Radio intercepts, captured that evening from Army Group B, revealed officers arguing over what they were seeing. One report described strange concrete islands appearing off the coast. Another claimed the Allies were using captured French fortifications as floating bases. At 7th Army headquarters in Saint-Lô, General Friedrich Dollmann demanded aerial confirmation. His intelligence officer responded that Luftwaffe reconnaissance could not get close enough. Allied fighters dominated the skies. The few photos that returned showed blurry, angular shadows on the water. One caption read simply, "Unknown structures, possibly bridgeheads." But one man, Major Alfred Becker, a German engineer and veteran of the Eastern Front, looked at the photographs and understood immediately. He had spent years studying Soviet improvisation in logistics, watching the Red Army build pontoon bridges under fire across the Dnieper and Volga. What he saw at Normandy dwarfed all of it. "They are building a harbour," he told his superiors. "In the open sea." His commander laughed. "Impossible." Becker didn't argue. He simply said, "Then we have already lost." Allied engineers called it Mulberry B. Its twin, Mulberry A, was being assembled off Omaha Beach for the Americans. Together, they would soon rival the capacity of the world's greatest ports. At Arromanches, over 300 ships lay anchored behind the new breakwater. Cargo vessels unloaded supplies at an astonishing rate, every crate, every jeep, every artillery shell essential to sustain the expanding front. On the beaches, the tempo of war changed. Where chaos had reigned on D-Day, now there was rhythm. Convoys rolled inland toward Bayeux, Caen, and Carentan. Engineers erected pipelines under the surf code named Plateau, for pipeline under the ocean, to deliver fuel directly from tankers to the beach depots. The sheer scale defied imagination. Within 72 hours, over 9 tons of material were being landed daily through the Mulberries. By comparison, during the Depot raid 2 years earlier, the Allies had been unable to maintain even a single supply line for more than an hour. Now, with no captured port, they were sustaining an invasion the size of an empire. To the men working there, it didn't feel like history. It felt like exhaustion. Corporal Thomas Hanley of the Royal Engineers described it years later. "We worked 20 hours a day, sometimes more. The sea was cruel. Every tide undid what the last had built. But we knew if we failed, the whole front would starve." The men operated under constant threat. Luftwaffe raids came nightly, dropping bombs that splashed harmlessly or tore holes through pontoon decks. One bomb struck a Phoenix caisson directly, cracking it open like an eggshell. It sank upright, still serving as a seawall. That became a metaphor among the engineers. Even in failure, we function. Meanwhile, inland, the German command faced a nightmare of its own making. The Atlantic Wall had been designed to repel an assault at the ports Calais, Le Havre, Cherbourg. Yet now the enemy had sidestepped all of it. Rommel, returning from Germany, where he had been briefing Hitler on defensive reinforcements, arrived too late to intervene. He toured the Normandy front on June 9th and saw the beaches transformed into floating cities. He immediately grasped the scale of the problem. "We no longer fight on the shore," he told his aide. "We fight against their factories." For the Allies, the Mulberries were not just a triumph of engineering, They were a statement of industrial supremacy. Every piece of the structure, from the smallest bolt to the largest caisson, had been forged in British, Canadian, and American factories. The invasion was not simply a military operation. It was a demonstration that democracy could outbuild tyranny. But nature, as always, had the final vote. On June 19th, barely 2 weeks after D-Day, a violent Channel storm rolled in from the Atlantic. Winds reached gale force, waves cresting at over 20 feet. For 3 days, the tempest raged, hammering the Normandy coast with unrelenting fury. Allied ships broke anchor and ran aground. Barges overturned. The beaches vanished under sheets of spray. When the skies finally cleared, the devastation became clear. The American Mulberry, off Omaha Beach, WWII, was gone, shattered. Its caissons cracked, its floating roadways twisted like ribbon. Engineers waded through wreckage, counting the losses. In one night, the harbour that had taken months to plan and days to assemble had been erased. The British Mulberry at Arromanches, however, survived battered but standing. The reason was simple: deeper anchorage, better positioning, and a dash of luck. Mulberry B, the British harbour, would now carry the burden for the entire Allied front. The remaining resources would be diverted to reinforce the surviving harbour. The operation could not pause. Supply had to continue, or the advance would die in place. And it did continue miraculously. By July, with repairs complete, the Arromanches Mulberry reached full capacity. 9 tons landed daily, then 12 That meant tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, rations for hundreds of thousands of men. Everything moved across steel roadways that rose and fell, with the tide roads that had never existed before D-Day, built by men who refused to believe in impossibility. From the German perspective, the picture was one of disbelief turned to dread. Aerial reconnaissance finally confirmed the full extent of the artificial harbour. The photographs were staggering: miles of piers, ships lined up like city blocks, cranes unloading ceaselessly. One intelligence report to Berlin described it succinctly. "Army has constructed a functioning port on open sea. Situation unprecedented." At Hitler's headquarters, the reaction was fury. The Führer accused his generals of incompetence, convinced the images were forgeries. Rommel, summoned to explain, arrived exhausted and resigned. "My Führer," he said, "we are witnessing the collapse of our assumptions." Hitler refused to listen. "If they have no ports," he shouted, "then destroy their beaches." But it was already too late. The beaches were no longer the point. By July, the Allied front stretched inland across Normandy. The supply lines flowing through Arromanches fed the push toward Caen and Saint-Lô, then west toward Brittany. The tonnage landed through the Mulberries dwarfed all previous amphibious efforts in history. Every shell fired, every ration eaten by Allied troops traced its origin back to those floating roads. When Cherbourg finally fell at the end of June, the Germans destroyed its port facilities as planned. Cranes toppled, docks mined, warehouses burned. It didn't matter. The Allies no longer needed them. The artificial harbour had already fulfilled its purpose. It had bridged the gap between beach and victory. In retrospect, the Mulberry harbours were more than engineering triumphs. They were proof that belief could be redesigned. The Germans had believed in walls, fortresses, and immovable defences. The Allies believed in motion, in the idea that human ingenuity could outpace the limits of geography itself. Rommel's final report to Berlin contained one bitter line: "The enemy has solved the problem we considered insoluble." For the men who built the Mulberries, that sentence was vindication. Years later, when the remnants of Mulberry B were finally dismantled, sections of it were left in place at Arromanches. Today, at low tide, the sea still withdraws to reveal the broken silhouettes of those concrete giants, the ghosts of the harbour that changed the course of history. They stand silent, wave-worn and grey, but their story remains written across every ton of steel and concrete that crossed the channel after them. A reminder that wars are not only won by courage or by command, but by the refusal to accept what others call impossible. By August 1944, the rhythm of invasion had become the rhythm of a continent awakening. The beaches that had once been soaked in blood were now the arteries of an empire in motion. Convoys rolled through the Norman countryside in endless lines. Jeeps, half-tracks, fuel lorries, ambulances, all tracing their origins to the floating harbour at Arromanches. From the air, Allied reconnaissance photographs showed something extraordinary. The channel itself had become an extension of Britain's industrial heart. Cargo ships queued like patient leviathans, awaiting their turn to unload onto those steel roadways that flexed and groaned with every tide. Each tide carried history forward, 20 feet at a time. The Mulberry harbour was no longer a construction, it was a living organism. It breathed with the sea, fed the armies, and exhaled victory across Europe. For the men who built it, however, there was little time for celebration. Captain John C. Roberts, U.S. Navy, recalled the weeks after the storm that destroyed the American Mulberry. "We thought the sea had beaten us. Then we saw the British one still standing, and something changed. We stopped thinking of it as a harbour. We thought of it as a bridge across the channel, across doubt. That bridge carried more than steel and supplies. It carried a transformation in how wars would be fought. Before Normandy, every invasion in modern history was tethered to geography, ports, harbours, natural harbourage. The Mulberry shattered that dependency. It proved that mobility itself could be engineered, that victory could be prefabricated, towed, and assembled, wherever will demanded it. Inside Eisenhower's headquarters, the daily tonnage reports became the pulse of progress. Every figure told a story. 10 000 tons, then 12 000, then 15 000 tons landed per day. Ammunition dumps grew into small cities. Fuel flowed inland through Pluto's steel arteries. By mid-July, Allied troops advancing on Caen and Saint-Lô were consuming 500 gallons of petrol every day and receiving it without pause. When Eisenhower cabled Washington that our logistical situation is now assured, he wasn't speaking in abstraction. He was acknowledging that a handful of engineers and shipwrights had done what armies alone could not build: certainty in the midst of chaos. In Berlin, the disbelief never fully dissolved. The German High Command treated the Mulberry photographs as curiosities, not omens. One analyst at OKW scribbled in the margin of his report, "Ingenious improvisation, unsustainable in the long term." Yet by the time that note reached Hitler's desk, the Allies were already halfway across France. For German soldiers retreating through the hedgerows, the concept of the impossible harbour became rumour and legend. Some claimed the Allies had used captured French shipyards underwater. Others whispered of floating fortresses assembled by American factories. Few ever learned the truth that the same industrial imagination which built the Liberty ships and bombers had now built a harbour capable of moving continents. As August gave way to September, the Allied advance broke through Normandy's hedgerows, liberated Paris, and surged toward the Rhine. Behind that, momentum lay the unbroken line of supply that began at Arromanches. Even when Cherbourg and Antwerp eventually opened, the Mulberry remained active, unloading, repairing, adapting. Its floating piers had become symbols of adaptability itself. When American trucks of the Red Ball Express thundered eastward day and night, their drivers carried slogans painted on the sides, "Through mud and blood to the Rhine." But behind the paint was a quiet truth: they drove on steel, shipped across a sea once considered impassable. The men who conceived the harbour rarely saw their creation in its glory. Churchill visited Arromanches in late June, standing on the cliffs in a dark overcoat, his cigar glowing against the wind. He watched trucks crawl across the floating causeways and said softly to those beside him, "This is the victory I asked for, before it began the victory of the mind." Lord Mountbatten, who had nurtured the project under secrecy, later wrote that the harbour was the most remarkable engineering feat since the pyramids, but built in weeks, not decades. For those who had once called it madness, silence became their admission of awe. Among the workers who returned home, memories of the project remained raw and personal. Welder Ellen Harrison, one of hundreds of women who laboured in the shipyards of Glasgow, remembered watching the last Phoenix caisson depart under tow. "We didn't know what they were for. They looked like floating cathedrals." Months later, when the papers showed them at Normandy, I cried. We had built something that saved lives without firing a shot. That sentiment captured the heart of the Mulberry legacy. It wasn't only a weapon, it was a salvation by construction. By the war's end, engineers calculated that the Mulberries and associated beach operations had landed over 2,5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. Every shell fired during the liberation of France, every tank that crossed Belgium, every ration eaten by soldiers marching into Germany, traced its lineage back to those floating roads. In military academies afterward, strategists studied the operation not as an isolated miracle, but as a turning point, the moment logistics became art. From Korea to the Falklands, from humanitarian relief to modern amphibious warfare, echoes of the Mulberry system persisted. Modular construction, rapid deployment, the merging of engineering and strategy. Even today, the principles that governed those harbours shape every modern port and offshore installation, the idea that stability can be built where none exists. Yet perhaps the truest legacy lies not in blueprints or tonnage, but in belief. Because what the Mulberries truly dismantled was the tyranny of assumption. For years, the German command had considered the laws of war immutable. Armies must capture ports, bridges must span rivers, harbours must rest on land. The Allies replied with a single defiant gesture. That question, asked by dreamers in overalls and answered by soldiers in the surf, redefined what nations could achieve when imagination outran fear. In the summer of 1944, standing on a bluff overlooking Arromanches, war correspondent Ernie Pyle wrote, "You could stand there for hours, watching ships that never stop coming, roads that never end, men who never rest. It is as if the sea itself has decided to join the army." He was right. The sea had joined the army, and, for the first time, it fought on the side of possibility. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe the following spring, many of the Mulberry structures were dismantled, their steel recycled, their concrete sunk as breakwaters for new ports. But not all of them vanished. Today, at low tide in Arromanches-les-Bains, the outlines of the Phoenix caisson still rise from the surf, barnacled and grey. Tourists walk along the shore, taking photographs against the backdrop of those silent sentinels. The sea laps against their sides, with a gentleness it never showed in 1944. If you listen closely, the tide still hums with the rhythm of engines and chains, the faint echo of cranes creaking under weight, of men shouting through salt wind. They are reminders that even in war, creation can be an act of courage. The Mulberry harbours did more than sustain an invasion. They reshaped the moral geometry of conflict, proving that intellect, labour and persistence could overcome brute force. They turned factories into fortresses, engineers into strategists, and imagination into a weapon as decisive as any artillery barrage. When historians later wrote that D-Day was won by logistics, they meant that the Mulberry was more than hardware. It was proof that faith in the possible could conquer oceans. Eisenhower, reflecting after the war, wrote a private note to his staff, "The success of the harbour operations remains, to my mind, one of the most outstanding examples of cooperative endeavour among allies. Nations can win wars not by destroying but by building." That sentence would become the quiet epilogue to the invasion of Europe. And so, decades later, when the tide rolls out from Arromanches and the sun cuts through the mist, the ghosts of those harbours emerge once more concrete, corroded, immortal. They stand as monuments not to destruction but to design, not to conquest but to collaboration, not to what was taken but to what was imagined. They are the legacy of the impossible, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hour, someone somewhere dared to build instead of break. And because of that, a world once divided by fear found a bridge across the sea. The morning mist clung low over the channel, blurring the line between sea and sky. From the beachhead, the soldiers could barely make out the silhouettes on the horizon, vague, monstrous shapes of steel and timber rising, where yesterday there had been only waves. The sea groaned beneath their weight, a sound like thunder trapped in the deep. To those who knew, it was the sound of a new harbour being born. The Mulberry project had now moved from theory to muscle. Each floating piece, each phoenix, whale and spood, had been tested in secret bays along England's coast, but now they were being assembled under live fire, under wind, under chaos. The Allies had landed, but their victory would rot on the sand if they couldn't feed it. Every tank, shell and bandage depended on the success of these floating docks. On the decks of the tugs, men worked like blacksmiths of the sea. Sparks spat from welding torches. Chains screamed as pontoons were pulled into place. Orders were shouted through megaphones, swallowed by wind. For every voice giving direction, a dozen men obeyed without question, men who hadn't slept in 36 hours, men whose eyes were red from salt and smoke. Captain George Reeker, an engineer from Minnesota who'd never seen the ocean before, the war stood ankle-deep in seawater, clipboard in hand, counting the sequence of parts being floated toward the head of the causeway. His pencil shook in the wind. He had memorized the blueprint down to the rivet, but the sea didn't care for blueprints. Each wave could bend a beam or twist a joint, turning months of planning into wreckage. "Get me the next span," he shouted, but his voice disappeared into the surf. Nearby, a sergeant clamped a steel cable onto the corner of a pontoon. The thing was huge, a metal block the size of a house, its surface slick with algae and diesel. As the tide surged, the pontoon lurched, nearly crushing him. Reeker grabbed the sergeant by the collar and yanked him back. The man stumbled, cursed, and went right back to work. There was no time for fear. Fear was a luxury of the dry. By noon, the harbour's skeleton began to take shape. The massive Phoenix caissons were sunk one by one, their hollow bellies filling with seawater, until they sat steady on the seabed. From above, the pattern looked like an unfinished necklace stretching out from the Normandy shore, a string of islands forged by hand. Every engineer on that beach knew what it meant. The Mulberry was not a harbour in the traditional sense. It was a better gamble that human will and mathematics could tame an ocean long enough to supply an army. The concrete breakwaters would blunt the surf. The floating roadways, flexible and buoyant, would carry trucks directly from ship to sand. It was, as one officer put it, an invention of desperation. Behind them, trucks unloaded crates of bolts, girders and spare winches. Men in khaki crawled through the maze of half-submerged structures, tightening, hammering, shouting numbers. A corporal recited a checklist, written on waterproof paper. Section Dry C connected. Section Dry D ready. Section Dry E, damn it. Where's Dry E? Blown off course, sir, a young sapper replied. Toog lost her cable. Then find her, or build another. They did both. Meanwhile, out at sea, the fleet waited like silent giants. Cargo ships packed with munitions and food hovered beyond the forming harbour. Each hour they waited was a risk: U-boats, air raids, drifting mines. But the order was clear. No ship unloads until Mulberry is ready. In the early afternoon, the wind turned. A low, grey front rolled in from the west, whipping the waves into fists. The smaller craft pitched violently. Men stumbled and clung to the railings. One of the phoenixes cracked along its seam. Water poured in. Reeker swore under his breath. If it sank too soon, it would block the channel. Get pumps on her now. I want every hose you've got. Engines roared to life. Men leaped from one bobbing platform to another, dragging cables like veins through a living creature. The sea tried to swallow them, but they fought it back with engines, ropes, and faith. They were building a harbour not on land, but in motion. By dusk, the worst of the storm passed. The sky cleared enough for the setting sun to throw a crimson sheen across the waves. The half-finished harbour glowed like a wound reflecting firelight. A young private named Ellis leaned against a girder, panting. His gloves were torn, his fingernails black with grime. "Feels like we're building the Tower of Babel," he muttered to nobody in particular. Rika heard him and gave a tired grin. "At least ours floats." Each night, German artillery probed the coast, searching for weak points. Every flare that rose over the channel illuminated the impossible ships moored beside a beach that had no port. Cranes swinging over the surf, trucks rolling across bridges that moved with the tide. To the German observers watching from high bluffs east of Arromanches, it was incomprehensible. Reports trickled back to Corps headquarters. Enemy establishing floating docks, believed temporary. The analysts scoffed. A floating harbour, in this sea? Impossible. Let them drown in their own arrogance. But arrogance wasn't what kept the Allies working through the night. It was necessity. Without Mulberry, the invasion would choke itself to death. Every mile of advance into France depended on those floating planks and steel boxes. At dry null hours, Rika finally allowed himself to sit. The rhythmic clang of hammers still filled the air, but now there was something different, the faint creak of stability. The pontoons held. The first floating roadway stretched from the waterline to the waiting trucks onshore. It was crude, uneven, but it worked. He lit a cigarette, shielding the flame from the wind. Around him, men slept where they fell on the decks, in the mud, beneath cranes. He looked toward the dark horizon and thought of the engineers who hadn't made it this far. Those who died testing prototypes off Slapton Sands or drowned towing phoenixes through storms. Their ghosts felt close, tonight, whispering in the hiss of the tide. He didn't believe in miracles. He believed in measurement, in torque, and tensile strength. Yet what they were doing, this harbour rising out of nothing, felt like something beyond equations. Dawn came cold and gold. The first supply ship nosed toward the completed pierhead, her grey hull streaked with rust and salt. On the beach, hundreds gathered to watch. The ship eased in slowly, guided by tugs and hand signals. Her bow touched the edge of the floating roadway and held. A cheer went up. The noise rolled across the water like thunder. Rika felt his chest tighten. After months of theory and sketches, after sleepless nights and near disasters, the Mulberry was alive. Trucks rumbled down the pier, their engines growling, their tires splashing through seawater. They carried crates marked ammunition, priority, rations, medical, fuel. Each crate represented a soldier who would live another day inland. Each ton offloaded meant the front line could breathe again. By noon, the number hit 900 tons. By sunset, 2,000. Within days, it would reach 9,000, the daily miracle that would sustain an entire army. But the sea, eternal and indifferent, had one more test in store. A storm the worst in 40 years began brewing off the Atlantic. Barometers dropped, winds screamed through the channel. The engineers looked up from their work, reading the waves like ancient priests. The Mulberry wasn't yet complete. If the storm hit full force, it could undo everything. The order went out: reinforce every joint, secure every anchor, double the moorings. Men waded waist-deep in freezing surf to lash pontoons together. They drove spikes into concrete, tightened bolts until their knuckles bled. That night, the wind struck. Waves rose 10 feet, then 15, slamming against the breakwaters. Caissons groaned like beasts, chains snapped. One of the floating causeways tore free and spun into the dark, colliding with another. Sparks flew as metal scraped metal. "Cut the cable before it rips the whole line apart," someone shouted. Rika and 3 others crawled across a shaking pontoon, hauling an acetylene torch through the spray. The beam pitched, the sea roaring beneath them. The torch flared, slicing through the cable. The freed section drifted away, vanishing into the storm. They collapsed, soaked and shaking, but alive. For 36 hours, the storm raged. By the time it passed, parts of the harbour lay twisted and broken, but not gone. Enough remained to rebuild, enough to keep the lifeline open. When the sun rose again, the sea was calm, scattered with the debris of their defiance. The men went right back to work, salvaging what they could, welding, patching, cursing, laughing. The Mulberry still stood battered, but breathing. Weeks later, as Allied forces pushed deeper into France, a convoy of officers toured the harbour. Among them was an American general who had doubted the project's viability. He stood on the pier, watching trucks roll ashore in an endless stream, and shook his head. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "this is the damnedest thing I've ever seen." Rika didn't respond. He was too busy sketching reinforcement notes in his book, planning how to make the next version stronger. For every soldier who fought inland, there were 1,000 hands behind him: carpenters, welders, tug captains, engineers, all anonymous, all necessary. They didn't charge hills or storm bunkers, they built the ground those victories stood on. And when the news reached the German High Command, when reconnaissance finally grasped the scale of what had been created, the reports grew frantic. Enemy has constructed artificial ports, capable of continuous resupply. It was too late. The harbours were operational. The invasion that was supposed to stall on the beach now had an iron throat feeding it. One German officer scrawled in his diary, "We underestimated not their weapons, but their imagination." That summer, the Mulberries carried the weight of Europe's redemption. Each tide that rose beneath their decks was a reminder of human persistence, that even in war, creation could outmatch destruction. When Rika finally returned home after the war, he carried with him a small piece of rusted steel from one of the pontoons. He kept it on his desk for the rest of his life, a relic not of victory, but of endurance. He would tell his children, "We built a harbour where there was no harbour. We made the sea stand still just long enough." And when storms came again, as they always did, the thought of that floating city born in chaos, sustained by courage, reminded him that the impossible was sometimes just another form of patience. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.